I think we will begin, if that's okay. It has been, Elbridge, you won't be aware of it, but it's been quite a busy week in London. We had a congressional delegation visiting as part of the Association of Marshall Scholars, the Alumni Exchange, bring a legislative exchange to the UK to meet with all manner of people, including the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Defense Secretary, and many people here at Chatham House. So yesterday morning, was it just yesterday? Yesterday morning, we did host a congressional delegation, which included Mike Turner and Mark Green and Jim Hyams and many others. So it is a really important time. As you can imagine, people in the United Kingdom are not only clearly very focused on the big strategic questions that you take so seriously and have across many years of a very distinguished career, but also, as you can imagine, people are very much focused on the US election and what is coming next and what its consequence will be for the rest of the world, not least the United Kingdom, but Europe and far beyond. So we are very, very grateful that you're taking the time to speak with us today. We value the knowledge, and we need to understand the thinking of people like yourselves who have played a very important role in international affairs circles and grand strategy and defense strategy, both in Washington and the think tank world, and in government. For those of you who haven't met Elbridge Colby, and this is our first introduction as well, we have many people in common, but haven't actually met. Elbridge is currently a principal of the Marathon Initiative, which is a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of great power competition. He is co-founder of this. He is known to many people in the policy world for his extensive writings on geopolitics and strategy. And in 2021, you wrote a very lucid and clear book. There is no ambiguity in your thinking. And I have to say, I really appreciated that. The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, Yale University Press, 2021. I noticed you're a graduate of Yale Law School, Harvard undergrad. You spent 2017 to 2018 in the Trump administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. And in that role, you were the lead person, and maybe you can tell us more about exactly what that meant, but in developing and rolling out the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And you were, as I understand it, detailed as the Pentagon representative on the 2017 National Security Strategy. So you were critical to those two strategy documents, which saw China, put right out in front. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your writings. For those of you who don't have time to read the book, you've obviously contributed across many magazines and foreign affairs and online publications. So it's very easy, because you are so sure and clear of your views and geopolitics and geostrategy, which we appreciate. Although I'm not so sure that everybody in Europe will be filled with confidence in your recommendations.
I know.
With that said, let me start out before we go into your arguments. And I also have co-opted my dear friend and colleague Ian Bond for the Center for European Reform to also contribute to this question. We're going to kind of come back and forth with a few questions amongst you and myself and hopefully Ian, before we then open it up, rather than as prepared remarks, given the state of your thinking, which is very clear, and the priorities in your diary, which I'm sure are very long. Tell us, before we start on the geopolitics, tell us a little bit about your time at the Pentagon, at the Defense Department, and your role in these two really critical strategy documents. And you might even, given you have a UK audience here, set a little bit of the scene. Don't assume we know anything about what was going on in the Pentagon at that time.
I'm going to reach for my wallet. No, thank you very much, Leslie. That was a really far too kind introduction, although I don't pretend to mimic Henry Kissinger, but in this I will say I don't object to a kind introduction. So thank you very much. It was too flattering. So, and it's an honor to be with you and with Chatham House. I think it's the first time I've ever engaged with Chatham House. So delighted to do it. Wish it were in person, but hopefully in a future time. Look forward to the discussion. So don't want to take up too much With the pleasantries, but I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation. I mean, in terms of my role there, I mean, the way I described it in my bio, it's for those of you who've worked in the government, things like strategy documents have multiple inputs and they go through a process that actually, honestly, in many ways remains mysterious and opaque even to me. But my basic role was as the lead official working under Secretary Mattis and his, sort of team to develop the national defense strategy. The national defense strategy is the formal defense strategy for the United States. It's not the grand strategy. I'll get to that in a second. And obviously, that's grand strategy elements. What was notable about that strategy, and that came out in 2018, and we talked a lot to our British counterparts about that at the time, but was the shift towards great power competition, which you noted, Leslie, but also in particular the focus on China, a attempted refocusing on getting ready for a great power war, obviously with the logic being to deter it and sort of a back to the basics, sharpening the American military's competitive edge. And that was the sort of the main shift. So there were many people involved who played critical roles, but that was my main responsibility working for Mattis and the Trump administration. The national security strategy, there was a process run by my friend Nadia Shadlow, who was in the White House National Security Council. That was the broader Trump administration statement, which was released in late 2017. I was the Defense Department representative, but Nadia and the White House led that process.
Thank you. I will say, just for context, that for those of us sort of sitting on the outside of administration, sitting across the pond, not inside the bubble, things looked very chaotic, and so it's good to have you here to help us understand, the strategy and the strategic thinking that was taking place. And maybe one thing that we can also talk about is the extent to which you feel like your strategy got traction at the level of policy and implementation. But let me first ask you, perhaps you could say a little bit about that strategy and about your current thinking. You clearly, set out, unambiguously that the 40% of the global GDP sits in Asia. China is rising and is a considerable competitor to the United States on pretty much every dimension, and that the U.S. should be focused on preventing the emergence of a regional hegemon in the Indo-Pacific, by which you clearly mean China, and also thinking very clearly about who the United States takes on as allies in the region that it would actually look out for, and not to push that too far. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more on your thinking on that.
Sure. Well, let me just say briefly, I would say that, at risk of patting ourselves on the back, but despite reports of chaos and so forth, I think our strategy really did initiate, and it also, to quote Kissinger again, you can't have major strategic shifts without it reflecting underlying realities. It was and was perceived as a very significant shift in orientation. And in part, I think substantial part, it was because of the disruptive and sort of it broken the kind of calcified mold bureaucratically, organizationally, and under Mattis and President Trump's administration, we were able to shift quite significantly. And I think the proof is in the pudding, in the sense that I've only read the outside version, but the 2022 National Defense Strategy of the Biden administration basically continues, along the primary, the kind of fundamental parameters of China is the priority, great power competition. The force planning construct is very similar, basically focused on winning the one big war rather than simultaneity, trying to deprioritize other theaters, et cetera. Did it get traction? Yes, absolutely got traction. My point is that we've made a lot of progress, and this is my point to our Japanese friends, our Taiwanese friends, et cetera. It's made a lot of progress and traction, but not enough given the continuing growth of Chinese power. And what I would say about China is China's already risen. In the sense that China is a bigger economy. We can use market exchange mechanisms. I think normally in geopolitics, people use purchasing power parity. Maybe you can kind of mix them up, but China's already a larger economy relative to the United States than any state has been since the United States passed. I believe Great Britain, it might have been Germany in the last, I think it was the last quarter of the 19th century. So and by the way, its industrial base is already far, far larger than that of the United States. So whether or not China is going to continue rising, and that's obviously a matter of debate and degree and so forth. But I mean, China's already there. It doesn't mean it's a peer of the United States in terms of human capital development, et cetera. It is actually in a number of fields of technology, at least according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. But that's my basic argument. And thank you for your, I take it as a compliment. Thank you for your kind words about the lucidity of my book. One of the things I try to do, I mean, why did I write the book? Given that in a lot of ways the strategy had already changed, well, especially in an American system where there's, you know, multiple power centers and separation of powers, et cetera. And then with our allies, like for instance, the United Kingdom, I was trying to, I called kind of the platonic version of the strategy. I mean, I think we got about 85% of what we needed in the actual strategy, but I tried to develop the logic comprehensively and put it in as clear and, as you say, unambiguous a way so people can evaluate it. I mean, I'm not hiding behind jargon or technicalities or stuff like that. It's a very clear argument. Obviously, people have different points at which they disagree or multiple points at which they disagree, but at least I think strategy is better off. I'm in the, I guess, the hedgehog version of strategy, which is kind of the keep it simple, stupid version of strategy. And I think, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, what's happened in recent years is consistent with my argument, which is disturbing, actually.
I'm going to ask you, rather than kind of trying to survey the globe, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about China, Taiwan, and the national defense industrial base. And then I'm going to let Ian ask you about Europe and your views on where Europe sits in US strategy. That's your preparation. So you say a couple super interesting things in the book, many interesting things. One is about your differentiated credibility. So I'm going to come on to that. But first, I'm going to throw something at you that I'm borrowing from Jack Snyder, who you probably know, well-known professor at Columbia University, who was very close to Bob Jervis, who read your chapters, was my PhD supervisor. I said, Jack, what do I ask Elbridge Colby? He, by the way, had a lot of very interesting things to say about your book. He thought it was very worthwhile read. And he said, and I quote, ask him whether a Trump administration or a Biden administration would have a better chance of avoiding war with China between 2025 and 2029, and why?
Okay.
It's a good question. So
yeah.
I
think the Trump administration, because I think, look, it's sort of a cliche, but it's the peace through strength and it's a prioritization. I mean, look, since you asked me to engage in the politics, I think when the Biden administration came into office, there was relative peace in the world. Now we have a massive outbreak of war in Europe, and the war in the Middle East looks like it's already broken out, and it might expand. And the Biden administration, one of the things that I gestured at this is that they don't dispute intellectually or analytically the priority of China. So their stated defense strategy and other strategy documents say they're going to prioritize China, and often Asia. That's a little more contested because they have. I'm sure we'll get to this, but they have a more global. Jake Sullivan wrote about this in Foreign Policy, and he was responding to something I've written. I'm more focused on the military balance and thus hard power and the regional balance for reasons I can elaborate on. But they have not actually. I mean, there are good things happening in our posture in Asia, but they're manifestly inadequate to the scale of the Chinese military buildup and other, particularly the military buildup, and the other preparations the Chinese are moving forward on. So I actually think if this trend were to continue, especially given that the war in Ukraine looks unlikely to end anytime soon, the war in the Middle East looks unlikely to end anytime soon, probably the only way on this current trajectory to avoid war in the Pacific would be if we accommodate the Chinese, which I think was essentially the direction that the Biden administration was going late last year in the meetings in Northern California. It was, and if you look at the press, I can get into the details, but they're essentially trying to park that issue, and they're trying to stabilize it by avoiding any kind of sort of significant provocation, which I partially support. But I think the Trump administration, Kellyanne Conway was on Fox the other day pointing out that the Trump administration, a second Trump administration, would be focused on China. So I think that would present another problem, which is that the Chinese might decide that they have a closing window, or they may decide that for other reasons they might try to sweet talk the Americans into some kind of a deal. I just don't think that would actually be compelling, and I don't see how that would work. And I think both our strategic interests, certainly, but also politically, Republican voters in particular, but I think a growing swath of American voters see China as the primary challenge. And so, obviously, I'm not speaking for anybody but myself, I'm just speculating. But, if you look at the first Trump administration, you look at what, where the political winds are, where the strategic factors are moving. I think, to answer Professor Snyder's direct question, I think a Trump administration would be better off.
So let me follow up on that and get you to tell us a little bit about this idea that you have about differentiated credibility. It's commonplace, I would argue, here in the United Kingdom and beyond, for people to make a series of comments. They're not all the same, but they are along the lines of the US decision to pull out of Afghanistan reduced its credibility and was certainly a factor that shaped Putin's decision to invade Ukraine because it undermined US credibility. Another argument that's frequently made is that if the US doesn't stand up to Russia by supporting Ukraine, that it will have repercussions for America's credibility in the South China Seas and with respect to deterring China from using force to reduce Taiwan's independence. Tell us what your reaction is to that, and maybe in doing so, you can elaborate on this idea of differentiated credibility. I'm not sure I fully grasp it, but I'm sure that we will be very interested.
Well, thanks. Let me, because it's an important question. I think I'd preface it with something I've kind of gestured at on Twitter before, which is that of all the allies that the United States has and that I deal with, I would say, with possible exception of, say, Canada and New Zealand, because they're kind of just checked out, frankly, of the strategic conversation. I actually think, paradoxically, my arguments seem to be most misaligned with the British foreign policy approach. I have struggled to find in the British foreign policy or political conversation people who are actually aligned, which is not the case in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Poland, France for sure. Germany's trickier, obviously for other reasons, but it's given that the British have such a self-conception of being an active and still being a if not a global, at least a significant power beyond their borders. It's quite striking to me. And I actually think, to your point, Leslie, another way of putting it is that the British foreign policy discussion, at least as I can detect, and when I've engaged with senior British politicians, for instance, it's some kind of variant of like neoconservatism, which I would code, to use a PhD term, although I'm not a PhD, as right liberalism, the kind of more assertive, militarily aggressive liberalism, or liberal internationalism of the kind you'd see from like Tony Blinken or the Biden administration. And so one of the reasons I wanted to do this event is I'm concerned about this because, obviously the United Kingdom is probably our closest ally, along with Australia. There's a lot of people who think the way I do, for instance. I'm concerned about this, and I want to see if it can bridge, because maybe stepping back and just kind of looking at where the future political situation is. And again, I don't have any authority or any special wisdom. So, check, as with my book, openly disagree. I don't have a monopoly on any wisdom or insight. But I think the way that the European Council on Foreign Relations did a very nice job of mapping out, I think, the way that Republican foreign policy camps are. On the one hand, you have the primacists, which sometimes people call neoconservative, but it's really more about primacy, which is, as Robert Kagan would put it, global liberal hegemon, the world's policeman, whatever. The good part of that is that, the world is a dangerous place, and the United States is the only other superpower other than China. So if we're not active, it's not like the world's going to turn into a nice place. In the same way that you need police in a community, you can't defund the police. The problem with that is it doesn't reflect the actual power situation, which is that China's the first. I mean, Kagan himself made a very telling error in a big Wall Street Journal piece where he said that China was weaker than the three Axis powers, whereas actually China itself is larger as an economy than the three Axis powers were relative to the United States alone, let alone we were allied with a Britain which still had an empire, and the Soviet Union at the time. And it also neglects to grapple with the fact that our extensive interventions over the last generation have been pretty I mean, I would say they have not succeeded, and in some ways they've probably been counterproductive. On the other side of the spectrum, you have what some call isolationists. I think that word is used tendentiously too often. So I think their own terminology would be restrainers, which is like, look, all these wars are cooked up by the military-industrial complex. They're unnecessary. We can let other countries balance. I think what's good about that is hopefully avoid getting us into more Middle East wars that are not very helpful and tire us out. But on the other hand, the downside of that is if you just let the world go, China will dominate Asia, et cetera, in my view. The prioritizers is the camp that I'm part of. That would be in the middle between, that would kind of try to take the best and the worst out of that. But I think that sort of mindset does not seem to, I don't see it very much. I see much more what I would call the primacist type mentality, more or less. I mean, the difference in American foreign policy 20 years ago was between primacists over how much you had to use military force. It did not contest the underlying assumptions and overall foreign policy agenda. So that all said, my way of looking at this is, as you know, from kindly reading the book, is Asia is the most important theater. Military power is what's going to matter in particular, not because military power is fun or interesting or whatever, obviously to the contrary. It's because the only way to get countries to really do things they don't want to do is through military force. I'm just increasingly impressed that sanctions don't work. So what that means is that Asia matters for preventing China from dominating Asia. Europe doesn't actually matter that much, because whatever leverage, obviously doesn't have military forces anymore that can operate materially in Asia. I mean, the kind of ships the United Kingdom could send to the Asia Pacific could be a net negative for the United States, because the logistics demands and defense requirements and so forth. And I'm not, dealing with the Chinese anti-access area denial bubble, et cetera, would be very difficult. And then the sanctions that Europe, in theory, could provide, I don't think would make a difference on a triumphant, resolute China. And also, I actually think Macron did us a favor last year by indicating that the Europeans would not really necessarily come to the significant, economic defense of Asia. So what is differentiated credibility in this? What do I mean by differentiated credibility? Well, that's relevant because we need a coalition to check China's attempt to dominate Asia. The United States is neither strong enough nor, to the point, resolute enough on its own. So we need to work with local partners in particular. How do you foster and maintain a coalition? Well, this gets at the credibility issue. And again, I take sort of a middle position, because the primacists generally will say everything is connected. If you don't do this in Afghanistan or Syria, everything falls apart. And on the other hand, you have people who will say,
that was the argument that I was sort of put. So the primacists, or if you exit Afghanistan in this way, if you don't defend Ukraine, it will weaken America's success with respect to Taiwan.
There is something to it. I think it's a tertiary factor. What I will say is, I think the main thing that countries and actually the Taiwanese and Japanese governments actually are somewhat aligned. I think I've been trying to figure out why they are. I think they are actually liberals, which is extremely, in the international relations sense, which I think is extremely dangerous for their health and safety, especially in the case of Taiwan. I can get into that, partially because I don't think our foreign governments always make the best decision. Look at Ashraf Ghani, and of course the Ukrainian government thought that the Russians weren't going to invade. Why do I think that's not true? Well, we won the Cold War after winning in Vietnam. And the point about the Afghanistan thing is, it's actually not about coalition building, because if that argument were actually true, NATO would have fallen apart. But that didn't happen, right? Because basically the idea of differentiated credibility is that it's contextual. Countries are going to look and evaluate. It's going to generally factor in. But actually, if anything, NATO is probably at least went through a period where it was stronger. Now, Ukraine might matter more, although Ukraine is not a NATO ally. But Taiwan is going to matter in my context more, in my assessment, to the countries that matter in the potential coalition in Asia, because it's like right next door and it's clearly analogous. So it's a sort of a middle position.
No, helpful. So it's not that, yeah. Let me ask you one question about your arguments about the American defense industrial base and what needs to be done and what the problem is. And then I'm going to have Ian speak with you about Europe. You're pretty clear that there's been a failure to modernize, adapt, invest, and the proposal is what?
Well, the first part is knowing we have a drinking problem, right? So the issue is that my main point is that the scale of the problems with the defense industrial base are massive, and it's clear. For instance, actually, the Pentagon itself, in the original leaked draft of the National Defense Industrial Strategy that just came out said, we're not prepared for 2 war. And by the way, the Department of Defense's own planning guidance and planning, which is really a recognition of reality, is that we cannot fight multiple means. Now, what some of the leading kind of neoconservative types in the American Congress will tell you is, oh, well, the Ukraine war, we've invested and now everything's fixed. No. Like, it's far from fixed. In fact, in some ways, things might be getting worse in certain areas. For instance, because the demand for subcomponents is also happening because European defense industry is starting to finally resuscitate. So my point about the defense industrial base is actually not to assign blame. Assigning blame is important for accountability and political reasons and otherwise. But the main point is to get people to baseline on the parlous reality of the situation, which is that it's going to take us like half a decade or more to restock actually relatively old and fairly simple systems like Stingers and Javelins, let alone the anti-ship missiles. Or we don't have enough torpedoes. We don't have enough attack submarines. And then we're thinking that we're going to give attack submarines to the Australians in this part of this AUKUS deal, when it's going to take years to fix our industrial base, if we fix our industrial base. Because the problems are not, it's not even money. First of all, we're not investing enough money. But that's like only the starting point of the problem. We don't have skilled labor. We don't have the factory capacities. There's problems with supply chains and resources and minerals, et cetera. That's my main point. Then you say to yourself, okay, we should try to fix that. And I'm in favor. I've been on record for over a year calling for a national mobilization of our defense industrial base. And part of that's going to have to be a larger industrial ecosystem, which of course is going to create problems with allies on the economic front. But the most important thing is to say, okay, here's where we really are. Like, we are not in a good place and we have not fixed it and we are not going to fix it quickly. Ergo, the key point is we're in a situation of scarcity. That's my key message. Okay, if we're in a situation of scarcity, you have to figure out what's the most important thing and then what do you mitigate? Like a company that's in a difficult situation, or it's, got more stores open than it can afford, et cetera. That's the situation that we're in.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Ian. I am desperate to ask you, where's the money going to come from? Presumably, if you put more into defense, it's got to come out of something. Do you have a
let me just say on that, because it's really important, that despite a lot of my friends who are like the hawk type saying year after year after year we should double defense spending, ain't happening. You look at the negotiations and the budget, there's zero interest. Neither of the leading candidates for president of the United States on the Republican or Democratic side they're both against cutting Social Security. So if we're resting our strategy on dramatic increases in defense spending, you're resting it on a cloud. And by the way, even if we did get significant increases in defense spending, it would take years and years for it to really bear fruit.
Thank you. Ian Bond, Center for European Reform.
Yeah,
Ian.
thank you. I mean, that's been really fascinating. And actually, I mean, in a way, I don't want to talk about Europe because I want to start at least by taking on the question of China, because I'm not sure that I would feel as confident if I were Xi Jinping as you imply he should. And I just wonder, we all get our estimations of our enemies wrong. We kind of underestimated Putin. I wonder whether we're overestimating Xi Jinping. And what I mean by that is, first of all, the economy has not really bounced back after the COVID pandemic. The demographic situation is not great and is going to get a lot worse over the next 10 to 20 years. Socioeconomic situation of China, you've got a lot of underemployment, unemployment. Now, I suppose one way of dealing with that is you start a war and kill off a lot of your unemployed youth. But it's not perhaps the ideal way of ensuring that the Communist Party of China stays in power. So I wonder whether, we're making China not merely 10 feet tall, but 20 feet tall, when Xi Jinping looks at in the mirror and sees, 6 foot tall at best. So and I'll come back to the Europe question.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can bet. I'll say just very directly as an American, I don't think we can bet our future, given the importance that I place on denying China hegemony over the world's largest market area, on, from our point of view, optimistic assessments of their national and military power, especially when, relatively speaking, the risk of doing so is far greater with China than it is with Russia, which is, while it's gaining the upper hand, unfortunately, in the Ukraine conflict, is manifestly far less of a threat. So if we're just thinking probabilistically, obviously we should make sure that we, China's a bigger threat. And then again, probabilistically, from a strategic point of view, given the downsides of underestimating China, we should err on the side of overestimation. I don't think that the Chinese are 10 feet tall. The problem is that, let's say they're 5'7". There's a lot of them. They have the world's largest industrial base, like over 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. They have position. I think they have manifest resolve. I think that a lot of people in China do believe a couple things. One, that Taiwan is part of China. Two, that in the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is Xi Jinping's goal, not merely the preservation of the party. He's not like a cautious conservative kind of. He's the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is his goal, and also that the Americans are trying to hold them down. In particular, the Americans, along with our, Doc Hollidays or whatever. Well, that's an Americanism, but our sidekicks from their point of view. So let me break your question down, Ian. At the geoeconomic level, I tend to be relatively agnostic about what geoeconomic or sort of economic headwinds mean for China's incentives on going to war, except insofar as if you look, and my friend Dale Copeland, Leslie, I don't know if you're familiar with his excellent work, has written about why great power wars tend to happen. For instance, Germany in the First World War, Japan in the Second World War, is expectations of future economic growth and market access for a rising, major power economy. And the Chinese believe, from Xi Jinping on down, that we are trying to strangle them. So if they are facing economic headwinds and they believe we are trying to strangle them, that is a structural geopolitical incentive to go to war. Then you add on the nationalist irredentist elements about Taiwan. So, I mean, and then, look, the geoeconomic, they're already a superpower from like a, geopolitical point of view and a military point of view. So even if they slow down, it's not going to make that much of a difference because they already have a very large army. They're already ahead of us in a lot of key technology areas. So and then it's all relative. I mean, people talk about Chinese demographics. South Korea has a 0.7 replacement rate. Taiwan has a small replacement rate. Japan has a small replacement rate. So it's a common thing that's happening in East Asia. It's a problem, and it's a significant problem for them, absolutely. And of course, Xi Jinping is trying to deal with it, although they have not changed any of their fundamental policies despite the economic headwinds, which to me is very telling. They're saying some different things about the spirit of San Francisco, but nothing fundamental has changed, even in their last kind of big, I think it's called like the economic work meeting in December. They're still doing it, dual circulation, all this stuff. They're still going, which suggests that they do actually are preparing for, as she says, extreme circumstances or choppy waters, or the party says. On the military level, look, I think this is the thing that why they might not go, because I think if you look at the overall incentives for them, they believe they're being strangled. Taiwan's never going to fall peacefully into their lap, and the election of Lai clearly furthers that. So the military option is the only way to deal with the Taiwan issue, and it could allow them to create a secure geoeconomic sphere, to use a kind of Gilpin, Dale Copeland sort of concept, which is I think how they're probably thinking. And then they have other reasons kind of in the nearer term. The biggest question then, and this is the core part of my argument, is will they be successful relative to the issue of denial, which is to basically the ability to seize and hold the key territory of the targeted state, presumably Taiwan in this case. And in that case, I think there clearly are still questions. Now, I'm treating skeptically the obvious leaks that are coming out of the American administration, trying to downplay the risk from the PRC and the PLA because of their political interests and geopolitical interests, since the Biden obviously prioritizes Europe, mistakenly in my view, and is now consumed with the Middle East war as well as difficulties at home. I caveat, also, it's all relative. I actually found, for instance, people were saying, oh, they're purging their top leaders. I found this article on Google from like February 1938 talking about Hitler purging the German high command. And it's like, well, did that mean that Germany wasn't? I'm not saying Xi Jinping is Hitler, obviously, or that China is Germany, but I'm saying he obviously cares enough potentially to be overhauling his top leadership. And does he know that they are not? I think that's one of the lessons he's probably learned from Ukraine. Don't overestimate my own team. But it's all relative. We're fighting 100 miles, God forbid. We would be fighting 100 miles from their territory, something that they have laser focused on. Meantime, we're all over the place. And let's be honest, our military ain't what it was 25 years ago because we have been consumed in the Middle East. And now we're getting involved in another Middle East conflict. You know, we had an SSGN, which is one of our key capabilities, which is about to go out of the force, unfortunately, launching a whole bunch of Tomahawks into Yemen. I mean, really? And then we've given a ton of stuff to Ukraine. So in some sense, I look at it and I'm like, geez, if they could get even to like 80% from a readiness point of view, that's going to be pretty compelling to Xi Jinping, unfortunately.
Thank you. Before we come to Ian on Europe, I'm going to come to Jennifer Lin. I want to keep going on Asia rather than going back and forth. And I assume that Professor Lind, Associate Fellow here at Chatham House, based at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, something big's about to happen in New Hampshire, Jenny. We'll have a question on Asia. So is Jennifer coming in on?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Hi, everyone.
Hi,
I wish I could be there in London with all of you. I miss it, but I am enjoying the 12 inches of snow we got in the last couple of days. Bridge, thank you so much for being at Chatham House, even though not physically apparently, but it's really wonderful to engage with you. And I second Leslie's recommendation of his book. It was just so clear and analytic and obviously really important. I'm going to throw out kind of two things and you can nibble on whichever one you want. There's a fundamental question which I find we skip over a lot. And I keep trying to remind us to have the conversation. And that is essentially in the era that we're in an age of nuclear weapons, the US asking the United States to assume huge risks to prevent the emergence of Chinese regional dominance. Do we need to do that, right? Like, why are we saying this is such a fundamental issue for American security that even though it risks a war and a nuclear war, we think we need to go down this path? Aren't there lots of obstacles locally to China related to geography and the existence of other major powers there? Aren't there lots of obstacles to China gaining that regional dominance? So that's kind of a fundamental question before we even go down the path of what strategy we should use and so on. And then a second issue is, can we even do it? So thinking about the comparison to the previous great power security competition, the Cold War, at that point, we were starting with the US having the dominant share of the global economy. We had, not immediately, it took some time, but we did see our politicians, our political leaders forge a consensus around a containment strategy. The health of the American worker and American families was generally pretty good. Inequality not so low and so on. Inequality not so high. And then also with respect to coalition partners, we had Britain and France and other coalition partners spending respectable levels on their military. And we had the main country at the center of the security competition, namely West Germany, spending significantly on its military and raising the most powerful military in Europe. That's really different from now. Taiwan is, in my mind, inexplicably spending basically nothing on defense. Japanese keep making noises. Not a whole lot's going on there. The South Koreans don't seem interested in a security competition with China. The American worker, American families are experiencing long reductions in their health, leading to domestic political paralysis at home. How are we going to do this?
Well, thank you, Jenny, my good friend and co-author. We've tried to work on this together, and your work has had a huge impact on my thinking. So wonderful to see you. Let me kind of answer them together. And I think the issues that you bring up, Jenny, are going to be what you presented is kind of I think the very serious and difficult to grapple with question that, particularly on the Republican side, I think is increasingly going to be the question. And that's what you see. People try, that's why I don't like to use the term isolationist, because what you're saying is a version of what that is, which is not like isolationism as in some pre-cooked idea, but is both a question of like, is it worth it, which is a totally valid question, and also, are we even able to do it, which is of course interconnected, right? I mean, so my view, maybe I am enough of an idealist to think that arguments like mine and yours, I think, can move people enough to try to address this problem. And this is a really critical thing, I think, also for British participants and European participants to understand, that a lot of the prominent voices saying, you know, if this is a battle between democracy and autocracy is Biden, but a lot of senior Republicans as well, I think the risk that they run, I mean, I don't think it's correct strategically, but is it like it stretches the system so much that it breaks? Like that, you know, if you tie NATO, oh, if we don't do this for Ukraine, the whole thing's going to fall apart. And people just say, well, okay, in America, like, I think we'll be all right. But if you're saying it's all a package, and you're not addressing any of my concerns, and you're calling me an isolationist and whatever, I'm just going to tune you out. And I think that's a lot of what's happening. I mean, we saw it in Iowa. I mean, people are just like tuning out a lot of stuff that they're hearing from American voices, let alone European voices, right? Which is like, for most voters probably in Iowa are thinking Europeans are like, they know where to put them on the spectrum, right? So I'm just being candid with you that that's the risk that you run. And I just don't think, you know, prudentially, like if you want to save NATO, prudentially, things have to change to stay the same. And to Jenny's point, to answer your question, I'm not near, and we've talked about this, I'm not nearly as sanguine as you are about organic balancing within the Western Pacific, because the very factors that you're talking about would lead countries which facing a China alone, essentially, to cut a deal. Of course, there are already tendencies to cut a deal. That would be the rational act. Like, is the Philippines going to put its neck out against China alone? No, of course not, right? And even certainly, I mean, Taiwan, you're going to have people flapping their wings like William Lai and Bi-khim Hsiao. But if they're left alone and the Chinese put a credible ultimatum on, what are they supposed to do? That would be suicide. I mean, they essentially are preparing for suicide. I don't understand what they're doing. That really strikes me as very bizarre behavior, because the Chinese are openly preparing to conquer them, and at the same time, they're not really doing much at all. And their political rhetoric is even more provocative to Beijing. Not to say that it's wrong, but it's just very bizarre behavior. And Japan's not. I mean, I was with a Japanese official who's like, oh, isn't it great that we're 2%? I was like, no, you should be at 3% now, not at 2% allegedly in 2027. So what does that tell? If the Americans go out, are these countries going to suddenly, are the Japanese going to turn up in a bunch of Bushido samurai and yelling bonsai? I don't think so. What they're going to do is settle. Let me just, is it feasible? I think it's feasible because of some of the issues that you're talking about, Jenny, which is if we lower our standard to denial and we can stop them from conducting amphibious invasions, which is a feasible goal at a reasonable cost, and that we've done before in the Cold War, I think the problem will largely be addressed. And then we're better off. Americans are better off. I'm making the argument about why Chinese hegemony is dangerous to Americans, but frankly, it sounds pretty remote. Last point, and Leslie, just go back to you. Last point is, and this is really critical, and this again goes against the interests of the Robert Kagans of the world. What we need to get rid of, we need to go back to a Cold War type policy. We need to jettison post-Cold War policy. In the Cold War, Europeans spent half of NATO military spending. It was a little less than half, but it was like 40% or something. And when it was a much smaller NATO. And by the way, we were really tough on allies that didn't pull their weight, including Democrats. LBJ in the balance of payments crisis basically forced the Germans to pay money for the privilege of having US forces in West Germany. That just makes sense. I mean, America first, people are, oh my gosh, obviously there's the historical baggage, but like, I mean, Angela Merkel was looking after Germans first, right? She was saving money and spending on the welfare. This can't go on. And the problem is that a lot of the foreign policy establishment in Washington has an interest in this liberal empire thing, but it's not, I don't think it's beneficial for the American people, and I don't think it's going to endure. And so if I'm trying to help save NATO and save these alliances by rationalizing the business, if you will.
Okay, I'm going to collect whatever's remaining in terms of questions on Asia, and then we really are going to, within 2 or 3 minutes, move to directly into the European question. I know that Bill Wolfforth has a question on Asia. Does anybody else have a question on about China or Asia? Bill, if you want to go ahead and state your question.
Yes,
Professor.
I can be heard? Yes, another Dartmouth participant here. Yeah, fabulous conversation, getting at the most fundamental issue in American grand strategy today. So it's great to be able to listen to it and even ask a question, which is, I want to still hear a little bit more about the first part of Jenny's question, which is, what's the actual downside of Chinese? I mean, I know you've been talking about this recently, but I want to hear more about it. Okay, well, they want change the territorial status quo in South China Sea and Taiwan. But after that, we have this idea of hegemony, which seems to be some sort of economic preeminence. And in some sense, China wants to trade. It will want to trade with us. Japan will want to trade with us. An East Asia with a looming Chinese, quote unquote, hegemon, but that doesn't take territory physically, will still want to trade with us, won't it? So in some sense, what's the downside of backing away from Asia and avoiding the risks of nuclear war that Jenny referred to?
Well, big fan of your work, Bill, if I may. So, you know, I obviously giant in this field. So thanks for the direct question. Look, actually, this is something I've been trying to think. I was thinking my second book. The problem is it's not really my thing. What I will say to you is that I believe that China's behavior is actually far more rapidly demonstrating the veracity of my assessment than any theory that I could come up with, which is that I think what their interest is, especially because they think that they are in the defensive mode. We have a sort of security dilemma at the geoeconomic, geopolitical level. And this is where I think Dale's work is, although Dale has a more dovish conclusion from this, I take his work and Gilpin type work to say the Chinese are going to create a geoeconomic sphere that they're going to turn into their own, everything's going to be around them. And I mean, to put it very telegraphically, and this, especially someone like you, I would want to add a lot more nuance, but just to be direct in the interest of time, they're going to orient the Asian economy, which is going to be upwards of 50%, and ultimately the global economy, they're going to make themselves richer. And using, I think Michael Lind has an idea about like, you know, wealth is relative, but prosperity is objective. It's a relative goods. There are relative goods in the economy. They're going to be, the best universities are going to be in China. So yes, they're still going to trade with America, but they're going to turn the Americans into a lower level of the echelon. And the Japanese may want to trade, but they're going to have to, because the Chinese are going to, and if you go back to what I think really works to coerce countries, it is a risk of territorial acquisition. It's not annexation, but they would use military force, and they're building a military to do precisely this. For instance, Xi Jinping has already dropped hints about the Ryukyus. Does he really care that under the Qing Empire, the Ryukyus had like a tributary relationship with the Qing? I'm sure he doesn't, but it provides a pretext that they're now normalizing that in the future can be used as political leverage over Japan. And by the way, yes, they could sail into Manila Bay, or for that matter, Sydney Harbor, or Seoul, right? And there will be a direct military threat. They're not building a military just for Taiwan. But the purpose of that is, I think, and again, it's simplistic, but the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which I feel like, again, and this is not my thing, I'm on thin ice here from an analytical point of view, but like Tom Friedman was wrong. Maybe if you could actually get everybody to sign on, then you would live in a flat world. But actually what we're seeing is that China has actually pulled huge parts of what is really important, to Jenny's point about having a flourishing industry and having a flourishing working class, to itself. And then if it were strong enough to force other countries to be like a majority of global GDP, that would be far worse. So, you know, Dartmouth, I mean, Harvard, Yale, whatever, forget it. They'd go like they're knocked down the pecking order. That now, is that worth going to nuclear war? I mean, I go on into this a lot in my book. It's not worth losing 50 cities. There's a probabilistic risk, and that's why it's so important to have the conventional forces to scope the stakes and to push the burden of escalation onto red, as we would say, or China. And that's really what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to correlate what is a very significant interest, in my view, with a military strategy that's actually, you can actually believe Americans following. I mean, last point on this, for instance, I think the US extended deterrence commitment to South Korea vis-a-vis North Korea is incredible if they can hit the American homeland, because nothing that North Korea can do to South Korea or Japan is enough to lose Seattle, Portland, San Francisco. Better for us to acknowledge this now and try to figure out some way of dealing with the problem. I think with China, because the stakes would be command of the global economy in the way that I'm talking about, it could be worthwhile to at least contemplate such risks. But, you know, that's my least bad take.
And you can see exactly what happens in all of this. Europe gets completely lost, and God knows what Europe's choices would be. I'm gonna turn to David Manning, Ian Bond, Jonathan Paris, I think, to bring Europe back into the conversation, but I'm not sure. Because it might not matter for the geopolitical balance, but it matters for those of us who live in Europe.
Right.
David, are you, can we hear from you? Sir David Manning, former British ambassador to the United States and many other things. Distinguished fellow here at Chatham House.
If you're able to unmute, David.
You hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. And I'm sorry I'm not with you physically, as it were. I hope I won't be treading on Ian's toes here, because what I'd like to do is move, I think, away a little bit from China. And I'm afraid I haven't read your book, which is an omission I must obviously correct. But let's assume your case that America is going in future be more focused on China than anything else. Where does Europe fit into American interests at this point? Where does the Middle East fit? And given that in the last 2-3 years, the real military confrontations have taken place in Europe and in the Middle East, and it seems to me, and you may disagree, that this is certainly something that affects US interest. How far does it actually work simply to, as it were, focus on one theatre at the expense of others? Or do you see having a galvanizing effect, as it were, on the Europeans by, as you said, making them spend more? I don't know what the answer is in the Middle East, but if you are giving this priority to the China factor, how do you see the United States' interests being sustained elsewhere?
Yeah. Well, look, thanks, Ambassador. I'm a Winston Churchill guy in this, who said, I can believe at the outbreak of the First World War, if we get things right in the decisive theater, then we can put everything else back as we want, right? If you're in a power position where you have the decisive theater and the decisive rival taken care of, then, you know, Churchill said about, people were worried about, I guess it was the Graf Speer, that might have been the World War II, but, you know, he said it was like the German battle cruisers going around harassing British shipping at the beginning of one of the wars. He said it's like a cut flower, beautiful but fated to die, which is to say, if you can get things right in Europe, you'll be at the time. And actually people say, oh, you're like these Asia firsters. No, I would have been a Europe first guy in the Second World War or before, because then Europe was the decisive theater because of GDP, productivity at scale, and it controlled the global empires. And by the way, the British, I think, have supplied probably the best example of this, perhaps the American focus on Europe after Vietnam, but Jackie Fisher and the era before the First World War, when Britain determined that Germany was the primary threat and Europe was obviously the primary theater for Britain, and settled disputes with, a lot of people like to talk about how we were shared democracies more or less at the time, but actually Britain also settled disputes with Tsarist Russia, Imperial Japan, and Republican France that had been going on for many, many years. And so, you know, how do I see Europe? I see Europe as less important and like a priority. It doesn't mean it's not important, but like a priority in a business, or, you know, the analogy I use is China's an acute case of heart disease. Russia's like a broken bone. It's very painful, it's very serious, but it's not the same level. The acute heart disease could kill you. Because I see military force, direct military force, as the only real way to coerce countries to do something they really don't want to do. And I have to stress how ineffective sanctions are against Russia, let alone China, which is vital to the economy of even the United Kingdom. And Germany and France, right? Not to mention Japan and South Korea and the United States. Do we really think that we are going to initiate sanctions? I mean, for instance, Bloomberg put out this analysis that was, you know, in a lot of ways very useful, showing that China would lose 14% of its GDP if a war over Taiwan broke out. But that was assuming that countries would take on like quasi-suicidal punishing sanctions against China, which, like, if I'm thinking about countries rationally, they might say they would do that, but it would be insane to follow through on that in many cases, and I don't think they will. And the evidence is before us that countries like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Europe itself is trading with Russia through intermediaries. I'm sure the United States is too. I don't mean that moralistically. Okay, so that means what is it that Europe has to offer to deal with the threat of direct military force? Well, in 1941, you had Prince of Wales and the repulse. That didn't go so well, but you at least had significant military forces of the European powers, certainly before that. There's no military forces that would matter in a Sino-American confrontation along the First Island chain. So we can rule that out. Economic sanctions, I don't believe, would move China anyway if it were successful in application of direct military force. And I don't believe the Europeans would actually follow through on it. That's why I say Macron did us a favor. Now, that doesn't mean that Europe is unimportant. But what it means is that Europe is important as the secondary theater. Obviously, it has, legacy, traditions, et cetera, et cetera. But like, I'm trying to look at this as like a business way from an American. Well, I think American foreign policy should be fiduciary for the American people. So the fact that we have a storied history, I had relatives who fought in the World Wars, who were involved in the Cold War. That's not the point. The point is what's in the American people's interest going forward, right? Europe is important. And so how do we deal with that? Well, we need to prioritize Asia. So I believe that I'm being a better friend to Europeans than many of the hawks and the primicists are by saying, don't worry, because you should be worried, because clearly the direction of travel politically and strategically is that Europe is not going to have the kind of situation that's existed for the last 30 years or in the Cold War. So what's the solution? Well, the solution to me is for European NATO, to Jenny's point, to spend a lot more. It's totally feasible. Russia is a smaller economy than a number of European states, at least using market terms. Europe could the Germans had this idea that the Germans were pacified post-war is a total fallacy. They had a huge military, as Jenny pointed out. So they could do that. The Poles are doing it. And by the way, again, it's not a binary 0 or 100. If the Europeans can get to 50, that'll probably be enough. You might not kick the Russians out of Ukraine, but life will go on in Europe. We can, over time, the Baltic states or whatever in the Soviet Union could try to, address the situation over time. But it will be satisfactory because we're living in a world of the best we can, not the optimum. And what I would say about Europe and the disastrous policy of this administration, I don't quiver to say that it's disastrous, despite recognizing that China is the priority, we are now more engaged than ever in Europe. And Europeans are more dependent than ever, which is actually what we don't want. Some people are making the argument that we fostered the Ukraine war to make the Europeans more dependent, but that's bad. We don't want dependent allies. We need countries more like India, Israel, to some extent South Korea, Poland, that are willing to do more. And this is where I would say with British foreign policy, just to be candid, where I do detect a potential problem is that there's so many British officials coming to Washington, making the case for maximalist aims in places like Europe and the Middle East. And the Brits will say, well, we're part of it. We give the weapons to Ukraine. Yeah, okay. There were 4 British aircraft participating, I think, in the raid on the Houthis. Or, but then you don't have any, the army is the smallest army since before Cromwell or something. And again, I'm not bashing on Britain, this is a common problem, but there's a significant dichotomy between the British political class attempt to influence the American discussion and what Britain is actually delivering. And let alone the difference between what Britain is calling for, including British conservatives, and where the American people appear to be. And I think that I just want to shoot a flare in this very special alliance that's something I think we should be more careful and aware about.
Bridge, can I ask you to stay for 10 more minutes? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Can you before I come to Ian and then to Jonathan, can you give me a 1-word answer to the question that I'm going to ask you, which is, do you believe that you can elaborate after you take Ian's question. Do you believe that Donald Trump's view on Europe, that you're basically aligned, that his view is basically aligned with you're obviously thinking more strategically, but is it aligned? Yes or no?
I'm not sorry, I can't, because I'm not going to speak to what President Trump thinks. I just want to be very clear that I'm not.
But in terms of what's been,
what I will say is this, Leslie, and I'm sorry to be
no, it's okay.
Honest, is that I believe that my view, there actually aren't a lot of leading American politicians who have endorsed it yet, but the momentum is clearly in the direction either of where I am or the restrainers. And I believe that my position, the arguments I'm making offer a natural equilibrium if there were a Trump administration, obviously it'd be up to President Trump and his key advisors and so forth. But look, the Senate is, in particular, but also the House leadership, you talk to Mike Turner, people like that are going to continue to have influence more on the primacist direction. But primacism is not going to, like, my view is like, even if, I don't think she is, but if Ambassador Governor Haley or Vice President Pence had won the election, they would not actually be able to put in place the policy they're advocating for. So I believe that what I'm arguing, whatever role I may or may not take, that is going to have a strong purchase as a kind of a middle position, and because I think it reflects both geopolitical and political reality.
Thank you. Ian's, thank you for being so patient.
No, that's absolutely fine. So, I mean, I have some sympathy for what you say, particularly about the British position, because we are not increasing our defence budget in the way that we should be. And we do have excessively ambitious aims in terms of our so-called Indo-Pacific tilt that are clearly not achievable with the amount of money that we're prepared to spend. So, there I agree. I think you're being actually rather hard on Europe as a whole, which has significantly increased its defense spending as a result of the war in Ukraine. But I guess the question that I keep coming back to is, if you say that sanctions are inadequate, you're implying that it is worth the US going to war in Asia for, a territory with 23 million people in it, when it's not worth going to war in Europe for a much larger territory, which also has some significance, like being one of the world's largest agricultural producers. I'm not sure that I can see the consistency in the argument. If it's, if Taiwan is worth the bones of quite a lot of American service personnel, why is Ukraine not worth quite a lot of expensive American hardware, but no American dead?
It's not about Taiwan. If it were just about Taiwan, I wouldn't advocate for it. It's about Asia, because Taiwan is critical. I mean, I said this in an interview with Foreign Policy on Friday. I mean, the Chinese are like the Soviets in the Cold War from a military point and geopolitical point of view. They're already in the center. So any residual, I mean, like, why would we have gone to nuclear war over Denmark or, even West Germany, like a bunch of people who we had fought two world wars, both of us in the, right? It wasn't about because we love West Germany, is because we couldn't afford the Soviets to have a dominant position in Europe, and especially over its largest, most productive economy over time. So that's what Taiwan is about. And Ukraine, I mean, Europe, like the American and Western interests, or whatever we want to call it, we're already in territory that like was Russian sort of area, and I don't want to use the whatever propaganda kind of stuff, but like Eastern Ukraine is really the extremity of whatever Europe has been traditionally considered. So like from the position of preventing Russia from becoming a hegemon in Europe, we got a lot of room. So that's why it's more important. I mean, and again, it doesn't make sense to lose millions of Americans or hundreds of thousands of Americans for any ally. It's for our own interest in that kind of systemic sense, and the allies are important to that. But I think we should be clear about that. But to your point about the Europeans, I don't agree, because a lot of these are pledges. The Germans, who are by far the most important, have done very little. Now, under Pistorius, maybe things will get better, but it's been like almost 2 years. Are you kidding? It's actually shocking. It's shocking. I think people should be shocked. And you yourself mentioned that the British are not following through on the commitments that were made under the Johnson government. Now, my view is, look, my argument is the Europeans should step up more. The Americans will help where they can. And then the deal is Europe should determine. So the Belgian prime minister, I think, said something yesterday about how we have to be more sovereign and more independent. I was like, great, fantastic. Like, it may not benefit some, I won't name any names, but it may not benefit some of the grandees in Washington to be able to go and tell, the Munich Security Conference and tell people what to do. But that's not working for Americans, obviously. And you can see by the political dynamic in the United States that it's not selling anymore. So you can see where the direction of travel is. And if I were Europe, and this is what I'm trying to do, I mean, I spend as a former Trump administration official, I'm not exactly like popular in a lot of places in Europe. But what I actually do believe in NATO and in the transatlantic link as something that works for both of us in a sustainable way. So I'm trying to communicate to, I mean, I spent a lot of time with the Germans, which is, you know, you take a lot of hits there, but that's the only way I can see the model working. If it's sort of like continues as business as usual, then I mean, there was something that leaked that was in the Daily Mail I saw about a German assessment. It was probably just a scenario, but I think the Russians are a serious threat. I think they're resuscitating their military, and they will pose a threat to Eastern NATO. I don't think they're going to march to the Channel, but you know, what I'm saying is, even if the Russians invade NATO and they haven't attacked Taiwan, my argument is that we should withhold scarce capabilities that we don't have enough of for both, so that we can deter the Chinese, because it's more important. So that should, and I've been arguing this for several years, and it's in the book as well. But that, I hope that's resonating, because Cavoli and NATO appear to be doing the right thing by pursuing a deterrence by denial strategy, but they also, from what I can tell from Stephen Erlanger's excellent reporting, they're relying on American levels of commitments that are inconsistent with what I'm saying. We have a one war force planning construct, people. Sorry, I don't mean to be, but like, we don't have enough for both, and we ain't going to Leslie's question about the defense industrial base. So if you're betting on the Americans, and my argument is, even if Joe Biden is president in a second term, rationally speaking, they should do what I'm saying. I don't know if they will, but if they don't, and then the Chinese would be crazy not to attack Taiwan. I mean,
Thank you, Bridge. Actually, you preempted the question. You preempted the question I was going to ask, which is, will the political headwinds push a Democratic administration? Were we to see one in the same direction? Don't say any more on that. I'm going to take Jonathan, Paris, and Elena, and let you answer both of those collectively as your last question. We are very, and I should also say that we would like to see you here in the UK. And I think if you do come over, you'll find that a lot of people would like to meet with you and to get your views. So don't make any assumptions that, you know, past service means that you won't be allowed to enter.
Thank you. I was waiting. I'm good with
Jonathan,
Hi, Bridge. You preempted a little bit of my question when you said that in the future, countries like India and Israel will have to do more. Those are the kind of countries that the U.S. will support. In the Middle East, would you look favorably on a new security architecture that was based around a Saudi-led system that didn't rely on the U.S. so much, but relied on a normalized relation with Israel and with the other moderate Arabs, to kind of keep the stability rather than to entirely abandon the Middle East?
Second
point, in 1980, I moved to Singapore and moved into the house that your father had lived in. I guess I got the Asia bug. What would Singapore and Indonesia, two countries that I happen to know well from our days at Kuder Brothers, what would those two countries be like under a Chinese co-prosperity zone? I can't
don't
imagine.
answer that yet, but you might tell everybody in the room who your father was, so that they have context. I'm suddenly reminded that you also did a nice interview with Joel Rosenthal.
Right.
Elena's got the next question. Elena's an associate fellow here at Chatham House and is also based in Brussels, works for the European Parliamentary Research Service. Is that correct, Elena?
Yes, thank you, Leslie. Well, and as you can see, we have almost as much snow as
okay.
Yes, it's a unique day. So thank you very much for this. Very interesting. And a lot of my questions have been preempted, and I'm already making a plea to Chatham House that we have you back for a conversation on the EU's defense industrial plans. But I won't ask about this. What I want to ask is two real quick points. One is, the conversation here in Brussels is actually also considering some degree of engagement with China when it comes to two big security issues. One is the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, and obviously they haven't joined any operation yet, but it's a challenge to China as much as it is a challenge to the US and Europe. So having heard you, I can assume what you're going to respond, but I wondered to what degree you're thinking about this. And then, of course, China and the reconstruction of Ukraine. Obviously, all of that with a view to sort of disengaging the growing China-Russia engagement that we're looking at very carefully. And then just a question, I don't know, I don't have time for a second question. I'll just
go ahead, if it's brief, go ahead, please.
Right.
Should I? Okay, sorry.
Yes.
Okay. No, I just wondered, I mean, it was about isolationism, and you've talked about this a bit, and obviously, again, something we're wondering here in Brussels, or many are. I mean, there's three scenarios really that people are looking at. One is US completely engaged in the Asia Pacific and therefore disengaged from the European front. The second is the European front requiring capabilities and therefore less engagement in Asia Pacific. And then there's the very isolationist US withdrawing from both these spaces. And I wondered if you think it's more nuanced now, this isolationism idea, than it has been in the past, and whether these three schools of thinking make sense. Thank you, Leslie, for the second question.
Thank you. And Bridge, we'll let you take whichever part of that you'd like to.
Okay. Thank you. And I'll try to be brief to respect everybody's time. And thanks for the kind words, and great to see you, Jonathan. No, I think the model to your first question, Jonathan, is exactly to be sort of ecumenical and essentially tolerant of what the indigenous balancing coalition looks like. And actually the whole predicate, I mean, and then it's a little bit Nixon doctrine, right? The idea being we can't be as directly involved. We're going to do things where we can be support, that are high value add. But if it's Israel and Saudi Arabia and whatever, and Jordan and great. And then let me jump ahead to Elena's point. Is that doesn't require a John Foster Dulles type attitude on China, because bear in mind, to go back again, the critical point is the military balance in Asia. Because economic sanctions don't count, this is an important point. I personally, and this doesn't necessarily reflect everybody on the right or anything, but I'm less concerned about European economic engagement or other forms or Middle Eastern engagement with China, because I think you will not fall under Chinese hegemony because of the difficulties of imposing sanctions without direct military hegemony, basically, to Bill's question. So that actually gives you, so the deal is more actually in Europe, take care of yourself more. Don't be like this sort of vacuum on American attention and resources. Instead, take better care of yourself. But part of the deal there is that the EU, and this should be Macron, frankly, shoots himself in the foot, I think, a lot on this, but it's actually consistent with a more sovereign, independent Europe. Now, when you say we're going to be autonomous, and it sounds like you're going to be on sort of equilibrating, that doesn't make sense, because obviously you need American help and engagement. But things like European defense industry, people say, oh, the Americans are benefiting so much because Lockheed's getting so many. Well, Lockheed's not helping. I'm not a shareholder in Lockheed. Like, it doesn't help most Americans. And if Europeans and Japanese and South Koreans are going to sustainably spend more on defense, it's got to be recycled into your own economies. So that's more the deal, is like, okay, we're going to take a bit of a step back. We're not going to disengage like totally, but we're going to reflect the relative levels of resource and political attention and money prioritization. So I don't object to Elena's question. Jonathan, your second question was, what is life like in Indonesia and Singapore? And I talk to Singaporeans a lot, not so much the Indonesians, but others like the Vietnamese and so forth. And I think I have no idea. I don't think that Xi Jinping is interested in spreading Maoism. The one time that Li Shangfu mentioned Marxism in his remarks at Shangri-La was to say that the Chinese Communist Party was critical for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is about nationalism. But what I do think is you're going to be, again, and forgive me, this is not as nuanced as it should be, but a kind of tributary state towards China. And the key geoeconomic, security, political decisions are going to be oriented around Beijing. And I think that's not as, so the interests of countries like Indonesia and Singapore and Vietnam and Philippines, et cetera, is to have a balance of power. So that's where their interests align. The question is, how far do those interests go? And if you're facing and this gets back to Bill's point, the very real threat of Syria. I mean, the Chinese are building aircraft carriers, which are not useful for Taiwan. They're building piers in Cambodia. That's to project decisive military force against smaller countries and other things. Not because they want to expand a next territory. Speaking of Singapore, there's a great conversation in his memoirs, Lee Kuan Yew talking to Deng Xiaoping, about you don't want to expand territory necessarily. Now, Taiwan is different, but that's, I think, what they're going for. Last point, I think, Eliana, to your question, or Elena, excuse me, isolationism. Look, I think it's very important. My advice to you as Europeans, in all humility, would be don't dismiss it and don't use these kind of canards, because it reflects, first of all, like it's a democracy, so people have to vote for it. And I think it reflects a tremendous amount of frustration with how the world has gone over the last 20 years. I mean, 25 years. I'm old enough to remember Bill Clinton, and he was a Democrat, but like at the end of his administration, there was a balanced budget, the world was at peace, China was a blip on the horizon from a military point of view. Here we are 25 years later, financial crisis, failed wars in the Middle East, huge war in Europe, wars in the Middle East, China might beat us in a war, drugs, crime, societal discord. It's like, I mean, people are holding regular Americans to a totally different standard. Like, sorry, how is it okay for Americans like me to spend 3+% of our income? That's a lot. And the Japanese to get away with spending like 1 or 1.5%, or the Germans. I mean, the audacity, honestly. And then to moralize to Americans, like, hello, like, do I have to go into the history? Like, if anything, they should be like bending over backwards to understand where America, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is so unfair, right? Like, just like, look at this as a normal person. It's crazy. Now, I'm saying I don't want to go there, but this is coming from a place, and it's not going to be stuffed back in, because it's very senior, and I'll finish with this, very senior Republican members of Congress go to Munich and say, don't pay attention to this. And here we are. And I'll tell you, I talk with conservative groups a fair amount. And one of them, who's a younger guy, he runs a very influential thing that Bill Buckley used to run or founded. And he said, I don't know anybody, he said this into the Free Press, under the age of 30 who doesn't mock neoconservatism. And this gets back to finish with Kissinger, is like, ideas aren't disproved, they become like laughable or illegitimate. And that's kind of where that is. And so I'm like, people often say to Bridge, you're cottoning or you're associating with people who are restrained. And I'm like, well, like, you're not going to just make these people go away. And in democracy, you have to credibly address their concerns. And so the best thing I could say to Europe is spend more on defense, take more responsibility. And actually, yeah, it would be great. Like, sorry, I'm trying not to name names, but certain people in Washington or in the government might not be happy that you're taking a more independent, but actually regular Americans might say, wow, hey, these people are really being partners. That sounds like a sustainable way forward. That's, I think, the best way forward for us together.
That was tremendously valuable for us, which isn't to say that people agree or disagree, but really, I mean that quite seriously. It's extremely important for us now, has always been, but now more than ever, to be able to hear from you. And I would like to thank you, and maybe we would all like to thank you.
Thanks. Nice to see you all.
But I do hope that when you come to the UK, you will be in touch in advance and we can arrange an in-person conversation. Thank you very much, Bridge.
Thank you. Thanks all. Have a good day.
This was great.
Bye.